A new month and a new game from Alireza Firouzja, and he's playing in an online tournament called the Chess Kids Masters Play-In. I must admit, I'm not very familiar with it, but there's some very strong players in this tournament. Anish Giri, Lebanon Aronian, among others. The time control is 10 minutes for each side with a 2-second increment. Firouzja's opponent in this game is David Anton Guijarro, one of the top grandmasters. He's been over 2,700, although I think he's a little under that right now. Firouzja has the white pieces. Guijarro has the black pieces. Let's jump right in. Firouzja plays e4. His opponent plays c6, knight f3, d5, and d3 is played by Alireza. Now, if you'll notice, we had a game not long ago, just a couple of days ago, that he played against Eric Hansen, and Eric Hansen played this very same system against Firouzja. Now we see Firouzja on the other side of it, the other colors, and Guijarro plays g6, just like Firouzja did, but in that game, Hansen played bishop to e2, played it like a reverse Philidor. You could play it like a King's Indian attack, but what Firouzja does here is he plays e5, immediately grabs the space available to him. This does weaken the f5 square a bit and give a few more squares to black, but in order to get squares, you have to give squares, and Firouzja grabs the space. Black plays c5, now c3. Firouzja is preparing to play d4 and create a strong pawn structure in the center with space. Knight c6 and d4. Now, looking at this structure here, basically, this can be reached in many different openings. Here we have a Caro-Kann, but it can also be reached in a modern system or a c3 Sicilian. But what you really need to know about it is that basically it's a French advanced structure. So if you understand the French advanced structure on a deep level, you can play different openings and you'll understand the structure when it arises. The only real issue left to be decided here is the bishop at c8 going to be inside the pawn chain or outside the pawn chain? Grandmaster Guijarro first takes on d4, creating a target that he can attack on this square, and then plays bishop to g4. He does not want to play e6 and trap that bishop inside the pawn chain. He wants it outside the pawn chain, pinning the knight on f3. Firouzja plays knight b to d2, and now Grandmaster Guijarro closes the pawn structure. Bishop e2, and now black plays bishop takes f3. Now, probably it would have been better if he had waited for white to prompt that capture with a move like, say, h3 first, so he wouldn't lose that tempo. But by playing bishop to f3, he is giving white the bishop pair advantage. That is something he is doing. At the same time, the position is locked, so perhaps the knights will do quite well against those bishops. And even more importantly, we talked about how d4 is the main target. Well, now black has 3 minor pieces, change that color, all of which that can attack this pawn, whereas white only has 2 minor pieces capable of defending it. So 3 can attack it against 2 that can defend. And I think that's this thinking behind bishop g4 takes f3. Bishop to b4 check, and here we learn, this is about understanding structure. A lot of people would just respond with bishop to d2 here, blocking that check, but Firouzja plays king to f1. And in the French advance, this is actually a pretty decent move because what he wants to do is activate his rook with the h-pawn, h4, h5. The rook can go to h3. And the king is actually fairly safe on f1 for the moment. So playing king to f1 against bishop b4 is common in this structure. f6, now black attacks the front of the pawn chain and maybe hopes to open up the f-file, aiming at white's king. Queen to a4, a very uncomfortable move for black. It pins the knight on c6, puts pressure on this bishop on b4, which is only defended by that knight at c6. Now queen to b6. Adds some extra defense to the bishop at b4, and also puts a little bit more pressure on the pawn on d4. a3 kicks the bishop back, but now that bishop goes back to f8. Probably wants to allow the knight to go to e7. But if we look at this position, notice that this king of blacks is actually not very safe. Where is he going to hide it? It's very open, and black could be in some trouble if he's not careful about his king. Here, h4 was played. Another strong idea was b4, followed by b5. But h4, activating this rook and gaining space on the king side. Pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, and now bishop to c5. So black is beginning to get some activity. And white's king, which was fairly safe on f1, now could become vulnerable. It's very hard, if not impossible, to defend the f2 pawn for the moment. But Firouzja decides to counterattack. He plays knight to g5, immediately going after this e6 pawn, allowing black to take on f2, but thinking that the central e6 pawn could be more valuable than the pawn at f2. Here, the best move for black was probably king to e7 to defend that pawn, but instead he sacrifices the pawn with knight g to e7, and Firouzja immediately takes that pawn off the board, and now bishop takes f2. And one thing about this white king, now it is lacking in space, and Firouzja is going to have to deal with the safety of this king. Black would love to play rook to f8 and set up all kinds of discoveries along the f-file. At the moment, that's hard because the knight controls that square. So if black can kick the knight away, get a rook to f8, Firouzja could be in very big trouble. In response, Firouzja plays rook to h3, and what it looks like is that he's preparing that if black is able to get a rook to f8, he can block it by playing rook to f3. But as it turns out, Firouzja has another idea than just rook to f3 with this rook to h3 move, a quite diabolical one that I think black might have missed. He responded by playing king to d7. Obviously, the idea is to hit the knight, and when the knight moves, rook to f8, just like we've been talking about. But that is when Firouzja's thunderbolt lands on the board, probably shocking to black. He plays rook to b3 instead of rook to f3, hitting the queen. And where does the queen go? All of the squares are covered. Those are covered by the knight. All these squares are covered. The only square that isn't covered is the square that it moves to is a5, because obviously the knight for the moment defends the queen. And black threatens queen to e1 mate. So Firouzja still has to be a bit careful here, but rook takes b7 check, giving up the knight on e6, but he says, I got so much pressure, I'm going to be okay. King takes knight, now bishop to g4 check. And it looks like black can just block it with the knight, but actually this does not work at all. Firouzja would take that knight, and after pawn takes, queen takes c6 check, and this ends up leading to a forced mate. It's quite a few moves according to the computer, but it is a forced mate. Pretty obvious that this king is going to be toast. So instead of knight to f5, Grandmaster Guijarro plays king to f7, trying to hide the king away. And here, rook takes e7 check. You can't retake with the knight because then the queen would be lost. So king takes is pretty much forced. And here, it would be a mistake to play queen takes c6 because, that's right, that queen to e1 mate was hanging over the board. So how does Firouzja continue his attack? Well, he does so with bishop to g5 check. Now, after king to f7, what we see has happened with this check is now the rook covers the e1 square, and there is no mate on e1, and queen takes c6 was played. And in this position, Grandmaster Guijarro resigned to Alireza Firouzja. Let's look at a couple of moves, a possible variation showing the winning concept. After rook h e8, for example, queen to d7, king g8, bishop to h6 with all kinds of threats all over the board, and we can see that black has no chance. And again, check out this video right here if you want to see the same opening, but with Alireza on the other side playing with the black pieces. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.